Hi guys, we've been talking in class about our responsibilities and civic duties as citizens of the United States and other things that are required of us. And today we're going to be talking about what our rights are as citizens or as people who are living in this nation, whether they're citizens or not. And one of the most important ones is the First Amendment. So we briefly talked before that the Constitution is in three parts. We have the preamble, we have the articles that are the rule book, and then we have the amendments. And the first 10 amendments are our individual rights. And they put the first one first because it was the most important to some of our founding fathers. The First Amendment establishes the most fundamental and important rights that we have as individuals. There are five rights protected according to the First Amendment, and they're freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of petition, and freedom of speech. First, let's talk about freedom of speech. That's a person's right to express their feelings or opinions on any topic, including the government or other elected officials. This is a really important right. In many parts of the world, you can get in big trouble, be thrown in jail, even decapitated for speaking out against your government. However, in order for a democracy to work, we really need to be able to be critical thinkers and express that thought to our government so that our government can best represent the people and can do what's best for the nation and do what's best for the individuals living within the nation. Freedom of speech protects all forms of expression, so art, music, clothing, symbols, and writing that express a belief under this right. If you have a t-shirt that says something against the president, that's protected under freedom of speech. Here we have an example of the Dixie Chicks concert where they were speaking out against George W. Bush's actions in Iraq. They have the freedom to do that because of the First Amendment, because the First Amendment, freedom of speech. We also have the freedom of assembly, which means the right to form and gather groups of people together. This could be meetings, like if you wanted to have a political meeting, if you wanted to have any kind of Democratic meeting, Republican meeting, a third-party meeting, a communist meeting, you have the right to do that because of freedom of assembly. You can have parades celebrating different beliefs, political rallies, public celebrations. And it's the right to gather in order to protest or publicly speak up against the government. So sometimes it's just saying your opinion isn't enough. It's a more powerful statement to get the word out to the government that we actually gather together and express our opinions in that way. And in this country, we have the right to do that. Again, that's not a right that is all around the world. Many people have died in trying to gather and express their opinions. And so it's something that is a really powerful way for us to be able to speak out, and in a way for democracy to work. We need to make sure that we are participating when we feel strongly about things. Freedom of the press, another freedom of First Amendment. This is kind of like freedom of speech, but published somewhere. So we think of it in terms of the newspaper, but could also be TV and other things. It's the extension of free speech that it protects the members of the media from being punished by the government for expressing their viewpoints or criticizing the government. TV and radio stations, movie, record companies, internet sites, magazines, newspapers all have the right to print or broadcast their story without government interference. At the museum, they have this big map of countries around the world that don't have freedom of speech, freedom of press. And it is really, it means that the government can get away with a lot of stuff, and people are not informed about corruption in the government. People aren't informed about things that the government is doing because reporters are not able to report that. Freedom of petition. A lot of you guys think of this as kind of the picture here on the left, where you want to have a change to the lunch menu, somebody writes a petition, and then you get lots and lots of signatures on it. That is one way to have a petition, but that's not exactly what the freedom of petition means. Freedom of petition gives citizens the right to contact their government representatives and request that they address an important issue or to notify the government directly of their opinion. Petitions don't have to be written, they don't have to be signed by many people. They can be submitted in person, over the phone, in an email, etc. And they don't have to be supported by many people. An individual may petition the government alone. So lots of you guys maybe have in your family or something gotten in trouble just for asking, that you ask if you can go out on Friday night and your parents are like, what? We told you a million times you can't do that. You're in trouble now because you even asked. So freedom of petition means we don't get in trouble just for asking. We can call a government official, we can send an email, we can send a letter, and that we have the right to ask them for change, whether we have lots of signatures or not. When we get lots of signatures, it kind of amplifies our voice, because then it says, well, it's not, Miss Dombrow that thinks that, but maybe if all the teachers at Rachel Carson sign something, it kind of amplifies it or gives it more power, but you don't have to have that to have freedom of petition. Freedom of religion is part of the First Amendment freedoms, and this means freedom of religion prohibits the government from establishing an official religion that everyone must follow. It also allows citizens to choose what, if any, religion to observe. Freedom of religion also forbids the government from favoring any religion over another or treating people differently based on their religion. So Thomas Jefferson was a really, really big advocate of freedom of religion. He thought that people, it was a personal matter, but definitely that the government shouldn't be involved. And though if you look at statistics of the United States, Christianity is the majority religion, it's against the Constitution for individuals to get preferential treatment because they're Christian, or for public schools that are run by the government or courthouses that are run by the government to have Christianity on their walls. The thought is that if you showed up for trial and you went to a courthouse that, say, had the 10 Commandments on it, and you happened to be a Muslim person who was going to trial, you might feel that you would be discriminated against because of your religion, that you're not part of the majority. So freedom of religion is really important in that way. We also don't give any kind of preferential treatment. You can't say that certain religions get a tax break where other people don't get a tax break. You can't say that you're only going to hire people who are Jewish, or you're only going to hire people who are Hindi or something like that. You can't discriminate on people based on their religion, or if they have any religion at all. We have the freedom to not have a religion. There are limits to the First Amendment. So one of the themes of this course is talking about the balancing act that the government needs to make. And we do have to balance what our individual freedoms are under the First Amendment versus what's best for everyone in society, or what we call the public good. So we balance, as individuals we have rights, but sometimes there are limits to those rights if that's what's better for the larger group. So people's rights to freedom, press, petition, and assembly are not absolute. That is, there are limits to how far you can take your rights. So the Supreme Court, who interprets the meaning of the Constitution, has decided that important public interests like the safety and security of all Americans may justify creating limits on these freedoms. So some examples is that freedom of speech is not protected when you use it to provoke a riot or other behavior. One famous example of this is a Supreme Court case that happened in the early 1900s where a man yelled fire in a crowded theater and many people trampled out of the theater, and some people were killed as people walked on top of them. And the man said, well, I had freedom of speech. I can yell fire, but you can't do that if it's causing a unsafe situation. You're not protected by freedom of speech in all situations. Freedom of press is not protected when somebody intentionally publishes false information to harm a person's reputation. So if a reporter is saying things that are untrue, they lose their professional credentials. They can even go to be called to court or even be sued. So professional journalists have a responsibility to be able to at least back up where they got their information and to show that they weren't intentionally publishing false information. And freedom of assembly is not protected when people gather in the middle of the street to protest the government or impede traffic. It's also not, you can't destroy property, for instance, or break the law. So if you're at a gathering and it turns violent and people start smashing windows and robbing things from stores, which has happened, then you can't say, well, I had the right to smash that car because of freedom of assembly. You had the right to gather together and draw attention to that cause, but you can't break the law, and destroying another person's property is the law, is against the law. Other limits, the First Amendment gives us many liberties, but it was not intended to allow Americans to do whatever they please. None of the amendments are. If we look at the Second Amendment that says we have the right to bear arms, that should also be balanced against what's best for the public interest and public safety. A civilized society must have limits and rules, so unlimited freedom is not possible when we need to live together peacefully and safely. The rights of an individual have to be balanced against the rights of the community. And that's part of being in a democracy. And this is one of the things that we'll get into about even what our own political beliefs are. Some of us might feel like it's more important to protect individual rights, whereas other people might err on the side of it's more important to be safe, even if it means that I can't have as much freedom in my rights as other people want. Rule of thumb, we can't possibly just memorize every single situation where the First Amendment applies or what the limits are. So the way we need to think about that, is in case we see it in a quiz or a test, is this way. You can exercise these rights without legal consequence if your actions aren't breaking any laws. So my example of freedom of assembly. You have the right to gather together and draw attention to your causes, but if people start damaging property, that's against the law. So you're not protected by the First Amendment right of freedom of assembly if you're doing that. Your actions are not impeding the rights of others. So we have laws against the noise level. You have the right to listen to whatever music you want, but if you're playing it so loudly that your neighbors can't sleep, then that can be against the law because you are impeding on the right of the other person to get a good night's sleep. And I want you to think about, would there ever be a time that you should exercise these rights while breaking the law and accept the consequences? One of the examples, Henry David Thoreau is an early philosopher that we might talk about later in the class, but a famous example of this is the lunch counter sit-ins. Segregation was the law in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, and a group of African American people sat at the lunch counters even though it was against the law, and they got arrested for it because they were breaking the law, but it was worth it to them to draw attention to that unjust law, to draw attention to a cause that was really important to them. So just something to think about. What are other times that it might be worth it to draw, to draw attention to an unjust law, even if it meant being arrested or something like that? So food for thought. The way that we remember our First Amendment freedoms, there are 5 freedoms under the First Amendment that we just went over. And some of it, has to do with speech and voice. So I think of raps, like rap music, is a way to remember First Amendment because our R stands for religion, the A stands for assembly, one of the P's is petition, one of the P's is press, and one of the P's is speech. So that's a really good way to remember the First Amendment, the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you learned a lot from this video.